Kathy's our next speaker. Kathy was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She attended Stanford University, where she got a master's, a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in child development. Later, Kathy earned her PhD in psychology at the Saybrook Institute, also in the Bay Area. Kathy's been in Missoula for 5.5 years, 5 of those years at the university. She originally came as a visiting professor or visiting faculty in the home ec department, teaching family relations. Photography, gardening, and traveling are her hobbies, she says, and I'm glad she's here tonight to talk to us, because if we'd waited 48 more hours, we would have had a tough time getting her, because Thursday she's on her way to Mexico. So Kathy, we're glad you're here, and I'm looking for your presentation.
I was in Bonn yesterday shopping, and I walked past a mannequin, and in the Cube they've got bathing suits now for sale, and there was a bathing suit on the mannequin, and the mannequin's arms looked kind of thin to me, and I knew I was going to give this talk, and so I went up. I don't know what they thought. Went to the upper arms, about this big around. I didn't measure that. I meant to today, but that looks like maybe 6 inches. And I went home, and my 14-year-old son weighs 93 pounds, and he's starting to get tall, and he's pretty scrawny. He's 5'1". And I put my fingers around, and his upper arm's a whole lot bigger than the mannequin, and the mannequin was probably, she was a lot taller than me anyway, maybe 5'8". And I introduced this way to let you know what our daughters are seeing in the Bonn right now as the kind of body that they're supposed to have to wear a bathing suit. There's a book by a woman historian that came out about a year ago, and it's called Never Too Thin. You know, you can never be too thin or too rich. Well, this woman looked at the changes in the ideal female body over a period of about 100 years. She started with the late 19th century and looked at a variety of historical documents about women and women's magazines and things like that. And it probably doesn't surprise you to learn that with the exception of the mid-teens, when the big breasts and the big butt were in style, the body size of women in the last 100 years, the ideal female body has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. She attributed this to a variety of things. One is people didn't have scales in their homes until the 1930s, and until, she said in this book, until about 1920, there was no standard sizing in clothes. People used dressmakers a lot. I was visiting with my mother last summer with my 15-year-old daughter, and we were taking out old wedding dresses, looking at them. And my mother has her grandmother's wedding dress, which was from probably 110 years ago now, I would guess. And my great-grandmother wore that dress in her wedding, and then she wore it for parties for many years afterwards. And the seams that were put in it were quite large, so that she could wear that dress while she was pregnant, and she could wear that dress as she got older. And so we, sort of turned it inside out, and we looked at the seams, and sure enough, there were a bunch of different stitching lines depending on how she was expanding and contracting. What she didn't know was that at one point she was a size 8, and at another point in her life she was a size 12. And as far as we can tell, women in that generation didn't attach self-esteem to body size the way we do today. I want to give you a couple of other examples of how society has shifted. The Miss America pageant did not occur until the 1920s. And of course that wasn't televised, or I'm sure that there were still photographs of the contestants, and maybe some old movies can be found of some of the earlier contests. But that whole notion of comparing women one to the other and selecting the best looking one as though that's the pinnacle of womanhood didn't exist until 50 55 years ago. So most of the women in this room right now have grown up in a culture that's told us that who we are is at least in large part determined by what we look like. That makes it hard to gain any weight without losing a lot of self-esteem. It makes it hard to age. It makes it hard to get your first pair of bifocals like I did in May. It's hard to have gray hair. I was talking to a woman who's a graduate student in the school psych program at the university, who's roughly my age, and she said, you know, as I've aged, I start to feel like I'm an it, because I'm no longer young, and therefore I'm not sexually attractive. This first Miss America contest, according to this historical book, Never Too Thin, said that the first Miss America was 5'5½", which was probably a little bit taller than average in those days, but be a pretty average-sized woman in our day, and she weighed 129 pounds. You know, if you've watched the Miss America pageant, and sometimes I let myself do that and I get mad and turn it off and stomp around the house, but you know that the women who win those now are 5'9" to 5'10", and when they announce their weight, which they always do, it's 110, 115 pounds. There are very, very few women genetically who can maintain that weight without starving themselves all the time. And my guess would be that with few very rare exceptions, if you were to look at women who compete in those contests, that they would tell you almost to a person that they use, I'll say, disordered eating practices to maintain that kind of a body. I knew a 16-year-old about 10 years ago who was selected to dance with the San Francisco Ballet in the chorus, which was a really neat thing for a 16-year-old to get. But they told her in order to do that she'd have to have breast reduction surgery because they didn't want somebody bouncing on the stage. And she would never be able to nurse a baby doing that. So we're paying a real high price for what we think we need to look like. Getting closer to home, I was at the counseling center at the university in between my current job and working in family relations in home economics. And in the spring of both 1989 and 1980, they had to close the trash chutes in a lot of the dorms at the university. The reason for that was that the young women were, and it's going to happen again this year, the warm weather comes like it did yesterday and today, and they've got to put on shorts. And we want a quick fix in this society, too. And that means you've got to get 15 pounds off fast. And so what do? You throw up. And there are other things you can do, too, which I'll talk about in a minute. But that's the most obvious thing. And in the dorms, it's hard to go into community stalls and vomit. People will know. It makes a lot of noise, and the stalls are lined up. So you go in your room. Your roommate's not there. If you've got a real eating disorder, you make sure you don't have a roommate. You lock the door. You get a bag. You throw up in the bag. You collect the bags. When nobody's in the hall, you sneak out and you put them down the trash chute. And so many young women were doing that the janitors were refusing to clean the trash. And it was jamming up. I mean, it was just filling up in the chutes. So we've got a real problem, obviously, on the university campus. We also know that last spring, obvious eating disorders cropped up in our high schools. It's not unusual for women who feel possessed by an eating disorder to be suicidal, because that's the only way they can think of to get rid of it. It's almost like it's like a possession almost. And we also know, when we talk to these young women, that their disordered thinking started a long time ago, when they were 8, 9, 6 years old. And some of their eating disordered behavior began to crop up at the middle school age. And so that's why I'm here to talk to you about it, is that we see the beginnings of this in our 11 to 13-year-old girls. Another thing that I think is probably related to this to some degree, I'm not sure how, is that when we look at females, their self-esteem is fairly equal to males until they reach puberty, early puberty, and then it crashes. And so what's happening is, in a culture that says you are what you look like if you're female, these girls are hearing this message when they're 10, 11, 12 years old, at the same time that they're losing a sense of competence, of efficacy, a sense that they have a future. I've had eating disordered young women say to me, the only thing that matters to me is attracting a guy and getting married. I can't be anything without that. The only thing that matters to me is that guys think I'm beautiful. I've had young women say, I'd rather be dead than gain 5 pounds, and they mean it. And so eating becomes a loaded issue for them. It's just an enormous problem. It's so big that it becomes central to their whole existence. And when a person is in a full-blown eating disorder, everything is referenced around the eating disorder. Young women sitting in classes are thinking, the hour's got to end. I've got to get back to my room and eat 15 candy bars. I have to do it. It's an obsession. So we're talking about something here that's incredibly serious. Statistically, for those of you that have daughters, 1 in 5 of your daughters will experience a period of time where her eating is disordered. Not meaning that she vomited one time, or like all of us, she ate too much at Thanksgiving and threw up because she felt uncomfortable. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a kind of a systematic way of managing weight. 1 in 5 will develop some difficulty with that, and I'll call that eating abuse behavior. Of that 1 in 5, 1 in 10, according to our current statistics, will develop an ongoing eating disorder, meaning that it's going to be with her for a matter of months or years. Once a person becomes eating disordered, and I'm going to get into some terms here briefly, we don't have a lot of time, but I want to explain to you what I mean by that. Treatment is not easy. It's quite expensive, especially if it's inpatient. Sometimes it doesn't take the first time or the second time. There's a lot of guilt and pain. These young women may go into a treatment program, somebody's taken out a second mortgage on their house to pay for it, and it doesn't work. It only works when she wants it to, not when her parents say, I want to send you to Seattle or Salt Lake or lock you up in St. Pat's. It doesn't work. It's a little bit, if you think about it, all of you have had toddlers around, and you know that if they don't want to eat, you can't make them. And if they don't want to go to the toilet, you can't make them. Well, when daughters are teenagers and they're struggling with an eating disorder, I think one of the things that's hardest for parents is they can't fix it. They can't make them stop. We all have ultimate control over what we put into our bodies and how we get rid of it. And so it's a real painful experience for families. And often these young women are very talented, and no one would ever guess. The woman or the young woman or the girl on the outside is a really special person and someone that we're all proud of. But on the inside, she's destroying herself. So that by way of introduction, I want to help get you into the world of someone who's struggling with eating issues. I gave this, I'm not going to read all of these to you, 50 statements here to a dorm last year, and they had to come listen to me talk, which a lot of them don't like, but their RA made them do it. And I handed this out, and I said, check off anything that applies to you. And even in a group of young college-aged women, some of whom had eating disorders, but statistically 4 out of 5 of whom did not. Most of them answered yes to these. I don't know when I am physically hungry. I often eat in response to my emotions. I eat things I shouldn't. It is difficult for me to eat in front of others. There are lots of forbidden foods I crave. Sometimes I feel like I can never get enough of certain foods. There are parts of my body that I hate. There are good foods and bad foods. Eating is a source of shame for me. I'm afraid to let myself get hungry. I feel like another person or power makes me eat when I don't want to. I find myself eating when I don't even remember when or how I started. When I am dieting, I feel good about myself. Except for a few select foods, when I eat, I feel guilty. It is easier for me to talk about sex than my eating habits. If I ate what I wanted and as much as I wanted, I would be enormous. Men like only women who are thin. There are many things in my life that aren't satisfying to me. If I let myself think about what I want, there would be no end to my wants. I don't have any control over my life. When I give myself what I need or want, I am doing something wrong. What I eat doesn't count if I'm not sitting down to eat it. I sneak food. I eat as quickly as I can so no one can catch me. I am depressed about my weight. When the scales show that I've gained, it ruins my life. I feel like everyone can see my fat. When I'm fat, people don't respect me. When I'm fat, I don't deserve anything, especially people's love and concern. When I'm thin, I feel powerful. I would die to be as thin as I was a few years ago. A few years ago, I would have died to be thinner. And it goes on. And by the way, if you're wondering where these came from, I made them up. So that tells you something about me. I have a handout sheet for you. People are often, in an audience like this, interested in recognizing eating disorders, in determining if somebody's got one, if they've got one, and so forth. And on one side of this sheet, I have some statements about what to look for. On the other side, there's an eating disorders fact sheet to help you know when someone says so-and-so's bulimic, what does that mean? Or so-and-so's anorectic, what does that mean? Because they're two different things most of the time. And I'm going to hand that out to you, I think, after I sit down, and you can look at it. And it's a way of my giving you a little more information without taking too long. I want to give it to you with a caution. And I think my caution is based on an experience I had at the university where some of the sororities were having a real problem with, primarily with bulimic young women. Bulimia typically means binge and purge, but it also could mean binge and exercise, or as Tony was talking about, binge and starve. It can be a variety of things. The critical factor is it becomes the core of your life. You can't concentrate when you're at school because you're thinking about it. The minute you get home, it's all you can think of. Lots of teenage bulimics have great amounts of food hidden away in various places. There's another thing that people do sometimes, and that is that they binge and then they take laxatives. And it'll probably shock you to hear how many. Usually 150 to 250 a shot, I mean, at a time. That's a lot. That means that your whole body chemistry is thrown completely out of whack. Anybody who had any kind of pre-existing heart irregularities as putting their life at some risk. And the first time I had a client who said 200, I go, oh, I got to get the ambulance, you know, because it was really scary to me to know that that was going on. I've since learned that that usually doesn't kill people, but that doesn't mean it won't someday. The other thing that people do is often they lose their gag reflex, and so they'll take syrup of Ipecac, you know, that you give babies and toddlers if they get into some poison, and they'll vomit using that because their gag reflex is gone, and that's also obviously real dangerous. I had one client who'd been in an inpatient treatment a total of 1.5 years in her life, and she, at the time that I started to see her at the university, was using 3 bottles of syrup of Ipecac a day, and she was a full-time graduate student. When you do that, what happens, if some of you have had really bad diarrhea, you know, or the stomach flu, you get incredibly weak, your thoughts get confused. There's no way you can sit in a class or get from one place to another, obviously, if you're using to that extent. But that's where it can go when it gets out of control. And I'm not trying to give you all kinds of scare tactics, but this is a serious problem, obviously. Getting back to the sororities very briefly, what was happening is the sororities were concerned that their image would be tarnished if anyone found out that they had bulimics in their midst. And so they started expelling the girls or young women who were bulimic. And pretty soon there were a bunch of amateur detectives going around checking on everybody and then hauling them up before a judicial board where they had to account for themselves. It was the most horrible thing. It didn't cure their eating disorder. It only intensified it. And then they would call me and say, we've expelled so-and-so and we want you to see her and fix her eating disorder. And it doesn't work that way. If you suspect that a young woman, and I'm saying women here because only about 1% of eating disordered people are male, and they're usually wrestlers or ballet dancers who get caught because they have to keep their weight down, as many women feel that they do. A woman with an eating disorder needs you to let her know that you know what's going on. I'm not arguing here for your not calling attention to it. But to call attention to it in a punitive way is very, very destructive. They'll just get more secretive. Most of the eating disordered people that I know or have worked with as a therapist are very, very sly. And if you create some kind of rule or punish them, they'll just find some other way to work on it, to hide things. I have a client right now who was stealing credit cards and taking the credit cards and using them to buy laxatives because she needed so many she didn't have the income to support it. And we were able to work with, she didn't really want access to the credit cards, but they were being left around in her family, and it was too much temptation. And it was important for her parents to say, we know what you're doing, we will not allow you to do that. And take away all those resources that she could use to run out and get the laxatives to support her habit. So you have to be honest with people and say, I see what you're doing. You don't pretend that you don't know what's going on, but you do it with compassion. And I guess that's a message I want to leave with you is, please think of this compassionately. These women are responding, as all of us do. Every woman in this room has felt the pressure to have to look a certain way. That we live in a society that measures us, and Tony referred to this, by all the externals. What we look like, the products we produce, how many A's we get, whatever it is. And nobody looks at the person inside, and nobody listens. And one of the things when working with eating disordered women is to help them express. First they have to know what they're feeling, and a lot of them don't. And then they have to learn to express it, and that that's okay. You're not bad if you get angry. You're not bad if you say, I need something. And that's how they feel. They have an emptiness inside, and they're filling it with food. So this could be a 3-day workshop. And I'm not going to subject you to that, but I will pass out this sheet, and it'll help you just identify the kinds of things that I've been talking about. Does anyone have questions? Yes?
It seems like especially with younger children.
Mm-hmm.
10 years ago, there weren't that many
Yeah.
kids that were 12 years old with this kind of problems
Mhm.
as many there are now. And now I see it in kids that are 9,
Mhm.
8, 9, 10, aware of being I have too much weight.
Yeah.
There's 4 kids over my house today.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the study, they all got bathing suits on. They went out with their towels, and they're doing all this like that. And all of them are thin.
Right. At that age, they're probably scrawny.
Yeah. And but it's definitely it's like some kind of
Yeah.
image compulsive thing where everybody thinks they have to be thin.
Mm-hmm.
For lots of different reasons.
I have lots of thoughts on that, and we don't have time tonight to go into them all. I certainly, my daughter who's 15, when she was 9, was sitting in the back seat of the car with 2 friends, and I was driving them to the ice skating rink. And they started beating on their legs. They had some little shorts on and tights, and they were going to go ice skating. Hitting their legs in the back of the car, going, back, 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 ugly, fat, fat, fat. Hitting themselves. I thought, oh, no. Right then, I was just starting to work with people with eating disorders. The other thing that I think is real important, and it's important in the entire addictions field, is we are role models for our children, whether we like it or not. And they pick up our virtues, and they pick up our vices. And many of today's mothers of girls and young women were caught in the 60s with the Twiggy routine. I know I was. When I was in the dorm, we put these big eyes on the ceiling, and it said, the diet god is watching you. And we went, and this was at Stanford, we went to the Student Health Service, 5 of us together when we were juniors, and said, we feel fat. Give us some diet pills. Well, in those days, it was amphetamines. Oh, sure. And they gave us bottles of amphetamines to go back and use, and we would just stop eating for 3 weeks. We're now the mothers of these girls, and I suspect on some level that our dissatisfactions with our own bodies are going straight to them, and that's part of what's going on. It didn't hit my mother's generation. It was happening, but not the way it did when Twiggy, I don't know what's happened to her, maybe she's gotten really huge. When Twiggy hit the scene. So I like to tell women who are concerned about their own daughters to first start working with themselves and their own attitudes about their bodies. And I don't mean you have to be perfect. Talk to your daughters about it. Talk to your daughters about your own struggles if you have them. Let them know.